Thank you very much, Bill, and hi to everyone. Welcome. I'll look forward to Q&A just to get to meet you all a little bit at the end of the presentation. So I will go ahead and share my screen. So as I said, good morning or good evening if you're up late in Australia or somewhere else, or when you are watching this. So as Bill said, and thank you very much, Bill, for the introduction. I'm really delighted to be here with the TKS conference. My name is Deb Breen. I'm the director for the Center for Teaching and Learning at Boston University in Massachusetts in the United States. So I am delighted to be here wherever here is for you. And in my presentation today, I'll be sharing some of our experiences of teaching and learning during the pandemic and reflect on what we have learned along the way. So although we are meeting in this virtual space, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement that is situated in the Boston area. I respectfully acknowledge that we gather here today on the territory of the many Indigenous Massachusetts peoples who have stewarded this land for hundreds of generations. I pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the truth of violence perpetrated in the name of this country, including the erasure of Indigenous peoples' histories. And since this presentation is also situated in Melbourne, Australia, I would also like to acknowledge the history and territory of the Wurundjeri people in the same way. In saying these words, I understand that land acknowledgements are a small but important step towards building a culture of respect, truth, and accountability. Apart from the personal and political significance of beginning with that acknowledgement, I have observed over the past year the expansion of land acknowledgements here in the US. Through the power of Zoom, I've been able to attend meetings in lots of other places apart from Boston, but particularly throughout the United States. And where meetings have started with land acknowledgements, people have posted to the chat to acknowledge the Indigenous origins of their own locations. So please feel free to do that if you would like to represent where you are from. It's been a wonderful burgeoning movement of seeing the memory and the reality of Indigenous land revived and acknowledged through this virtual space. So we've experienced the viral nature of social media before, but this seems to be something a little different. The ability to share and reinforce cultural and political information through the Zoom chat. And thus we form communities across many virtual networks. So we had the power to do that before the pandemic, but for whatever reason, many of us did not use it or experience it nonetheless. So that brings me to my topic, pedagogy and the pandemic, because the pandemic too has surfaced many technologies and approaches that we could have used before, but for many reasons we did not. And as I reflect on the past year, I'll be connecting to some of those technologies and approaches to see how they played a role in our pandemic year. So in the next 25 minutes, here's what I'm hoping to do. First, to bring you some context about Boston University as an example of a large private research university in the United States. Locally, the university is referred to as BU, so I'll likely slip into that abbreviation throughout the presentation. Then we'll go into challenges and opportunities. Challenge one was the unexpected and rapid shift to new modalities of teaching and how we supported that shift. Challenge two was to consider student responses to learning in the pandemic, including issues of equity and accessibility. Of course, these challenges are connected, so there's some overlap, but I'll try and simplify that as I go through. Finally, I'll reflect on what we might take with us as we move on to our new normal, though we are not yet sure exactly what that is going to look like. So let's begin with some context. Boston University is, by American standards, a large university, and I'm very conscious that by Australian standards, for example, it's not necessarily all that large, but it is one of the largest private universities in the US. It's also a highly selective university with a strong reputation in the Northeast and nationally. The Wall Street Journal and the Times Higher Education rank it as number 27 in the country. And this slide gives you a quick glimpse of some of the stats that incoming students and their families are interested in, and just to give you a bit of a sort of appreciation for the size of the university. Boston University is also a very diverse college with a relatively large international student body, as you can see from this graphic. Sorry, no, this is actually just about the ethnic diversity of undergraduate students. Although this does represent some of the other students as well. And then similarly, we have over 80% of our students coming from outside of Massachusetts. So both these figures, the diversity of our population and the out-of-state students, are relevant to our discussion of the student experience of learning in the pandemic. I'm providing this context for Boston University as an individual school, but it's also, we can draw a few generalizations from our experience. Not everything we've experienced can be compared to the experience of smaller schools, for example, but many of the experiences I'm going to discuss will be familiar across the landscape of higher education in the United States. I also want to note that much of what I have to relate may not seem new, particularly for colleges that have been experimenting with remote and hybrid learning for some time, and even more so in Australia, where distance learning has a rich and varied history. So recognising that times of crisis provide challenge and opportunities, as one of our former faculty coaches notes, and I'll talk about faculty coaches shortly. Folks were asked to do a lot, they were asked to give a lot, and as Catherine says, we owe it to one another to be as honest and forthright as we can about the challenges and opportunities. And I do intend to be honest and forthright, but just because of the time constraints of this conversation, there'll be many things that I won't be able to cover. So let's look at our first challenge and opportunity, the teaching experience. Here's a quick timeline that will look somewhat familiar to you for folks who are in the US, and maybe regardless of where you are in the world. The particulars may be a little different, but the general trajectory for higher education, I think, is common. BU turned to remote teaching over the spring break of 2020. Students went home for spring break in early March, and instructors worked feverishly over that week of the break to bring their courses online. And 1 week later, on March the 16th, we went fully remote. It was a huge undertaking, as you can appreciate, for that many students, that many teachers, and especially for teaching and learning, which was one of the key units that provided support for instructors. For CTL, the remainder of the spring 2020 semester was spent developing relevant guides, providing advice and support for numerous teachers, many of whom were not familiar, particularly with Zoom or other technology platforms they would need to communicate with students. Neither were they familiar with pedagogical approaches that were suitable for remote learning. So as you can imagine, it was a huge learning curve for everyone, for the teachers, for the students, and for the support staff. And you can see in the timeline here, we continued in fully remote mode throughout the summer. And then we began in full classes in Learn From Anywhere, and I'm going to come back to that shortly. But as Tom Underwood, Master Lecturer in the College of Arts and Sciences and the College of General Studies, noted, there was a huge challenge for teachers and for students, but particularly for students to see that the instructor and their classmates are genuinely present. And I think that notion of presence is very important in our experience of remote learning. And Tom goes on to say that remote learning does not mean remote minds, remote content, or a remote commitment by professors to their students. So this was something that we at BU really both struggled with, but worked hard to create that sense of community between teachers and students. So Learn From Anywhere was announced in June, and Learn From Anywhere is the BU name for HighFlex. So summer classes remained fully remote, but the university administration made the decision to turn to a hybrid modality they call Learn From Anywhere, or abbreviated to LFA. So LFA is very similar to the well-known HighFlex model, popularized in the US by Dr. Brian Beatty of San Francisco University. And it allows for synchronous, in-person and remote learning. And it will also be familiar to a number of universities in Australia who have been experimenting with this approach for well over a decade. So why was this model chosen? First, because it allowed for the possibility of a physical classroom experience for residential students. And this was a clear priority for BU, to provide continuity for the residential elements of the American education experience. However, Learn From Anywhere also addressed the needs of our international students who would not be able to return to the US for the fall semester. These students, many of them from Asia, would still be able to participate in their classes through remote learning. It also addressed the needs of the many out-of-state students who, for various reasons, might not be able to come back to the campus. So within a couple of months, between March and then through the summer and up until early fall, September, we had these two abrupt shifts. First, to fully remote learning, which was a totally new experience for most people, and then to simultaneously in-person and remote learning. So essentially teaching in two modes at the same time. So collaboration was extremely important. Under the leadership of Associate Provost for Digital Learning and Innovation, Professor Chris Delarocas, Boston University developed a support plan for instructors that involved 3 key units, and CTL was one of them. And I'm just going to talk about the other 2 before I get to CTL. So first, there was Learning Events Technology Services, or LETS, and Linda Jarrett led this group, and they were responsible for quickly upgrading all the classrooms, the regular classrooms, to provide the technology to make LFA possible. So classrooms were outfitted with ceiling microphones and with cameras to pick up lecturers at the front of the room. However, when we experimented over the summer, and this is a practice classroom with instructors and graduate students, it became clear that integrating the 2 audiences, the roomers and the Zoomers, was challenging from both the pedagogical and technological perspective. So where possible, LETS provided individualized technology solutions for teachers, depending on the need. So portable screens, additional speakers, Bluetooth headsets, media carts, all of these things were available for instructors or classrooms that needed more flexible solutions. Ernie Perez, who's our Director of Educational Technology, provided advice on room technology, but he also dived into hands-on support by filming numerous short videos that showcase technology in classrooms. And these were invaluable aids to our instructors. And it's just, I think this is one of those times where that term quick and dirty was really actually, quick and helpful, because this is really what we needed in the moment to bring instructors up to speed. However, as we practiced with juggling numerous technologies, many of them new to folks, managing different audiences, the experience of cognitive overload was common. So 12 months ago, I would have said that I understood the concept in an intellectual way, but now that I'm teaching a Learn From Anywhere class, I have a visceral comprehension of cognitive overload that has really astonished me. So my brain sometimes is practically fizzing with these different decisions that I need to make, and I'm unable to make choices about using technology that I would have previously said that I was competent with. And in fact, even Zoom, I would say that, I have sometimes thought I'm actually getting worse rather than better in the LFA environment. And my experience is not unusual. It was clear that instructors would find it difficult to manage Learn From Anywhere without additional help. So my colleague Ernie Perez was then instrumental in organising the Classroom Student Moderator Program. And this was a cohort of students who were trained to be technological facilitators for instructors teaching in the LFA mode. The moderators keep an eye on the chat. They let instructors know when the students in the Zoom space have questions, and they do quick troubleshooting on audio and other tech issues. So as someone who is teaching Learn From Anywhere class at the moment, I can attest to the value of the student moderator. So in fall 2020, we had 327 moderators working for multiple classes. And this semester, we have more than 200 moderators supporting instructors across hundreds of classes. The student moderator who works with my class, for example, supports 4 classes in addition to mine. So at this point, I'd like to go back and remind you now of the number of instructors at BU, and that's across all range from lecturers right up through clinical faculty and across our campuses, both the undergraduate campus, the medical campus and the education campus. So we have over 4,000 faculty. And this is the size of our Centre for Teaching and Learning at the start of the pandemic period. So we had 2 professional staff and 1 administrative coordinator. We now have a 3rd teaching and learning person and hope soon to appoint a 4th. But it was very clear that we could not provide the broad pedagogical support to the degree that it was needed across BU's campuses. So the 3rd pillar of support for teachers in the Learn From Anywhere mode was developed, faculty coaches. So over the summer of 2020, we provided targeted training for over 130 coaches. They were chosen by the departments and programs as instructors or sometimes staff who were respected by their colleagues, were knowledgeable about the teaching styles in their programs, and would be able to provide support to their colleagues for many of the questions that were coming up. So this decentralised model has been very effective in providing much needed pedagogical and technological support at the local level. And here are some of the ways that coaches support their colleagues. They've created instructional videos. They've created websites and Blackboard sites for their departments to showcase resources that are specific to the needs of their programs. They have used social media sites such as Pronto and Slack to maintain connections, and Pronto connects through our Blackboard site, so it's very easy for folks to use. Other people have created regular communication through email bulletins to their groups, and different programs have organised their coaching systems differently. Some folks have particular programs connected to their care, and others have particular individuals connected to them, and then other folks have more open arrangements in terms of office hours and so on. They organise brown bag lunches for colleagues, they make presentations, and they essentially work on building community to support each other in both pedagogical and personal ways. So as with the student moderators and the classroom technology support, the faculty coaches system has been an indispensable part of helping instructors navigate this difficult time. Not easily, but with more resilience and facility than might have been expected. In addition to the effective support structure that I've already described, CTL provided other opportunities for instructors to learn about technology and pedagogical approaches that could work in the remote and hybrid space. And we constantly had to keep in mind how small we were and how large the need was. Over the summer, fall, and this spring, we have had numerous lightning talk events with instructors giving very short talks, about 5 minutes each, about tools and teaching strategies with room for Q&A at the end. We have also had 2 events with student speakers where they gave their perspectives on the experience, which was very helpful for faculty to hear about. And the topics we have covered so far are listed on the slide. So since the lightning talk started in May 2020, we have had over 2,000 attendees at these events. The talks are now available in our video resource library, and the link is there if you're interested to look at it later. And they are frequently referenced by our teachers as really helpful sources for practical suggestions and advice. So have all these support structures meant that our instructors have had a straightforward experience of teaching during the pandemic? Not completely. So many instructors report emotional and mental exhaustion. They report that it takes additional time for them to prepare classes in remote and hybrid modes. And they also report that teaching in the Learn From Anywhere mode is very demanding. But nonetheless, without these structures in place, the learning experience would not have been anywhere near as successful as it has been. So let's turn now to some reflections on and challenges and opportunities for students. In seeking to support students, BU put in place strict social distancing and mask requirements, as did most higher education institutions that allowed students back on campus. BU also created very robust testing protocols, contact tracing, and isolation from requirements for students who contracted COVID or students who had been in contact with someone who contracted COVID. So these procedures were again typical of the approach of many institutions over the past year. All of those procedures were essential for the safety of everyone on campus, but there were also impacts on the student experience of learning and living on campus that came with those procedures. Students consistently report that they want the connection of face-to-face classes. The isolation of social distancing and the requirements for masks in and out of classrooms has been disorienting and isolating for many. Yet several aspects of the pandemic experience get in the way of this being in the norm in many learn from anywhere classes. And by that, I mean that even though students say they would like to be in classes, they often are not coming to learn from anywhere classes. So let's look at how the students experienced and responded to the challenges created by the necessary protocols of learning in a pandemic. And these perspectives are full of paradoxes and unintended consequences. So first, there were logistics to deal with, especially in the early days of the fall semester in 2020. Large classes were often in rotation as the number of students allowed in a room was cut to maintain social distancing. A student in a class that meets 3 days a week, for example, might only be able to attend in person on one of those days. At other times, they would attend remotely. This was meant to give every student on campus the opportunity to attend in person and have the opportunity to make those connections with their with other students, but also with their teachers that are really so important to the learning experience. But it meant also that those connections were more fractured and fragile than previously. So this is a plan of the classroom that I currently teach in. All instructors can access information about their classrooms to find out about technology and seating arrangements. And this classroom would have previously served over 50 students. It now has a capacity of 20, and that actually includes me as the instructor plus the classroom moderator, so it really can only take 18. So the dynamics of a classroom are dramatically changed for both teacher and students. And apart from the rotation question, many of the spaces that students would normally go to on campus between classes were not available to them. Or if they're open, they're also severely restricted in their capacity. So even as spaces became available, students were juggling the possibilities and the constraints of their own schedules. So having a face-to-face class, for example, followed by a fully remote class, made it difficult for students to choose to go to their face-to-face class. Between 1/4 and 1/3 of these instructors received accommodations to teach remotely for health or other reasons. And this meant that students might have a patchwork of in-person or remote classes in their schedule, either because of the instructors or because of rotations and other reasons. So traveling between classrooms and dorm rooms was often not feasible. BU is a very long urban campus, nearly 2 miles long between the eastern and western points. So in the past time between classes, many students could not get from their face-to-face class back to their dorms or an available space to continue with a remote class. So the impact of that was that many students chose to stay away from face-to-face hybrid classes and just do all of their classes remotely. So BU tried to address this by creating an app that showed students where open spaces were on campus. Students can use the app to book spaces to use between classes. And this has been extremely successful, that the uptake has been very high, but it still does not allow the same number of students to circulate on campus as previously. So for many students, the unintended consequence of scheduling and the mix of remote and hybrid classes meant that it ultimately was more straightforward for them to stay in their apartments or dorms so they could transition more smoothly between classes. So Learn From Anywhere is a really catchy title, and it really took on with the students. It really took their imagination. The Anywhere was meant to serve international students or a student who could not come back to campus for any reason, or students who were in quarantine on campus. However, it was perceived by BU students as offering flexibility and choice to go to class or to stay in their dorms or apartments and attend class remotely. So teachers and students alike reported a drop-off in the number of students attending class in person in the fall as the semester advanced, and also in the spring as we are about 4 weeks away from the end of the semester now. And as each individual student makes that choice not to go to class in person, it creates a very different and often difficult class dynamic for the teacher and any students in the classroom. So, for example, in my hybrid class yesterday, I had one student come in, and I had the student moderator in that class space that really, can take over 50 people. And as I left campus, I ran into a colleague who was just coming back from his hybrid class, and he reported for the first time he had no students in class, and was finding that difficult to really deal with. So while students long for the connection of the face-to-face activities, they are also choosing convenience, especially at a stressful time in the semester. So just to, reinforce that, we have this reflection from Stacey Godnick, who is the College of General Studies Associate Dean for Academic Student Life, saying we may be a victim of our own success. We really promoted this model, the Learn From Anywhere model, that you can learn from anywhere. We wanted to give people flexibility in an uncertain time. So, the good intentions of trying to create spaces for learning for the students actually had an impact on creating different kinds of spaces and reinforcing remote learning rather than in-person learning for many classes. So BU also put in place another support structure for students, recording of classes. So this has routinely been offered in many graduate classes, and neither the approach nor the technology is new. However, having many more classes, such as large undergraduate classes, being recorded on a regular basis was new to BU. So recording presented many pedagogical questions for teachers. Should they record lectures for students to watch out of class time and then create more active learning exercises for class time? Should they record discussions where students might be talking about personal experiences? And then what about those situations where international students or other students might feel vulnerable because their personal opinions differ from those of their home governments? So all of those were questions that instructors really mulled over very consistently in the beginning of the turn to Learn From Anywhere. So although the recordings were kept within the secure framework of our learning management system, faculty were also worried about the implications of recording, in the sense of, could the recordings be circulated more broadly? Or they were just personally not at ease with the notion of recording in the beginning. So paradoxically, though, students embraced the class recordings. They were beneficial for students living in time zones that made it difficult for them to regularly attend class. They were utilised for review of class material and for preparation, of course, for quizzes and exams. And they were useful for students who spoke languages other than English. So in short, although faculty had many questions about recording classes, students loved it for the flexibility of Learn From Anywhere. And they started to think of their education as not just learn from anywhere, but learn at any time. So this goes against the philosophy of undergraduate education as a residential experience. That is one that students mostly experience in person on campus. So what was put in place to support students in a crisis had unexpected consequences. There were other unexpected consequences of the remote and hybrid teaching and learning experience. How present are the Zoomers even when they are logged on to the remote space? Of course, research indicates that concentration has ebbs and flows, and physical presence is not a reliable indicator of focus either. Educational videos are recommended to be short, 6 to 9 minutes or even shorter, interspersed with activities to reinforce learning. But when a remote or a hybrid class is trying to replicate the face-to-face experience, both students and teachers are faced with other questions of presence. Is on-screen presence required to show that you are actively listening and participating in class? And students and teachers have been struggling with this question over the past year. Instructors are understandably demoralised by the increasing experience of black boxes, and I can attest to this myself. Students also recognise the impact that not turning on the screen has on the dynamics of the class. They will say that it's much better when everyone turns on their camera. But again, students' individual choices for flexibility and convenience may trump the overall class experience. And aside from this paradox, again, students wanting connection, but often choosing not to connect, there are other issues of technological access and equity, which is also a consideration here. The pandemic in the United States has laid bare the fault lines of inequity in communities across the country, and remote learning has made these inequities even more visible. So students may keep their cameras off because they are tuning into class from hotspots around their neighbourhood, parking lots outside libraries, for example, or because they are living at home with multiple family members who are also working or studying, or because their spaces reveal things about their living circumstances that they would rather not share with others. Or they may be connecting to class from their phones and not have the bandwidth or the power to maintain images. So all of these considerations of equity present differently in the remote and hybrid learning space. And both students and instructors have struggled with how to manage classroom dynamics in unequal technological spaces. The question of inclusion also speaks to participation as an expected element of many classes. In the fall semester, many instructors struggled with managing expectations for students in different time zones. Should they be expected to attend class regardless of time differences? Or should the instructor be expected to create class activities and experiences that could be meaningful for asynchronous as well as synchronous students? There's no easy answer to that question, as it depends on so many variables. However, while many instructors at BU were willing to work with individual students whose timetables presented extreme difficulties for attendance and participation, instructors have also increasingly set out their expectations for attendance and participation, and students in different time zones may then be left with managing their learning in the graveyard shift. So Sheila Shen, who is a BU student majoring in statistics, participated in one of our lightning talks in January. And Sheila is currently living in China. And I think the title of her talk says it all: Living Like Vampires During COVID-19. And she reported missing out on daylight and social time with her family and friends so she could participate in classes from across the world. And she also reported on the impact of living like a vampire, as she called it, on her mental health, of managing nighttime classes in the fall semester and sleeping throughout the day. Mental health has been a significant issue for many other students. Dr. Sarah Ketchen-Lipson co-led a nationwide survey of students that revealed half of students in fall 2020 screened positive for depression and or anxiety. And that's reported in BU Breen, which is a report of research conducted at BU. The survey also revealed that 83% of students said that their mental health had negatively impacted their academic performance within the last month, and that 2/3 of college students were struggling with loneliness and feeling isolated. So these findings confirm the mental health toll of the pandemic, something that has been more broadly reported in our communities. But this heightened student anxiety has also meant a lot more work for instructors as they struggle to support students in and out of class. And I've seen this in my own class this semester as students have openly shared their difficulties either during class conversations or in individual chats and emails. Anecdotally, many other instructors report that their pedagogical care has been outweighed to some degree by their pastoral care, and which has dramatically increased over the past year. So this is another challenge for teachers and students alike. So at a CTL get-together for faculty in the fall, instructors shared notes and stories and tips of how they are supporting students or making connections with students to help support them during the stresses of the pandemic. And here are some of the ways they are doing that. So many teachers are meeting individually with their students, numerous times throughout the semester, just for short meetings to check in. They are emailing them. They do beginning of class check-ins, and I do this frequently in my class as well, both the whole class check-in, but also little breakout rooms on the days that when we are doing remote classes. Walk and talk with faculty. Some faculty have made a point of creating little pods with students and walking with them throughout campus. Regular exit polls to see both, content-wise, but also just technological issues and personal issues, just how folks are going without breaking confidentiality. Others have developed ongoing icebreakers, so not putting icebreakers away after the first class, but continuing it throughout the semester. Polls that are fun as well as content related. Kahoot, for example, as a fun competition quiz. Using social media such as Instagram to create a sense of community in the class. Having students post video introductions, that's not necessarily new, but it's become much more important in this pandemic year for students to feel connected to each other. Group projects, so students get the experience of working together and collaborating, which they would have done in the past, in a more organic way, but it really has to be created in a different way in the remote and hybrid environment. They need to be short so that students aren't penalised if somebody becomes ill during the project. And then creating study groups for the students. So all of these are things that faculty are regularly doing to try and support students. So to cap it off, let's hear from Noor Siddiqui, who's a senior in the Sargent College of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences. And Noor was another one of our student speakers at a Lightning Talks event. And she says, "Do I wish my senior year looked different, that it was normal? Obviously, but I feel really lucky to be in a position where I feel this safe and able to be here in person and taking classes." So this was, I think, again, the amazing thing. On the one hand, the safety and the restrictions made students feel safe, but it also created some constraints on how classes unfolded. So where to from here? So I have covered only a fraction of what our teachers and our students have experienced, and I haven't really covered much about what the staff have experienced during the past year. And you likely have many stories that are similar to share. Similarly, when we are looking at the landscape of learning in the near future, we may be contemplating similar possibilities. First, students and instructors at BU want to return to normal. That is, in the US, that often means a residential campus experience which embraces learning and living together in the one place. Yet what we've learned will have an impact. And here are some of the ways that we imagine that the lessons of this past year will stay with us. So first, a greater facility with technology. So instructors in particular have a much larger comfort zone when it comes to a range of technology tools and devices. While there's no guarantee that instructors will continue to choose this range of technologies in face-to-face classes, the foundational level of functional use is higher. It's also higher for many students, and that gives instructors greater flexibility to think about different kinds of assessment tasks. So instead of asking students to complete a paper, for example, which is still very typical, many more instructors may be willing to experiment with digital forms such as infographics or brochures or digital posters. Having more routine recordings will also be in our future, and students will be then able to use those as support devices or support materials for their study. Another change we can take with us is how easy it is to create variation in our classes, and what we're doing right now is an example of that. We already knew this, but the pandemic has brought home just how efficient and practical it is to invite a guest speaker to class, or to incorporate multimedia in different ways. So face-to-face classes can look more varied and may incorporate different experiences as part of the regular in-person class. And this slide is from a guest speaker who came to us an advanced Spanish class, a Mexican film director, and the lecturer wrote it up for the CTL News and Announcement page. So you're welcome to have a look at that at some point. This year has also had a big impact on how we think about experiential learning and global programs and study abroad. Remote learning has meant more flexibility in thinking about how to provide students with access to learning experience in other countries. Students who find it hard to participate in study abroad programs for reasons of their major, of athletic commitments, or financial constraints, all of these students will now potentially be able to engage in classes that may be taught from elsewhere, or that may be taught at BU, but are immersive experiences in virtual experiences where they can experience a culture without leaving the US. I know it's a different kind of study abroad, but nonetheless, it opens up possibilities for many students. The technologies and these possibilities are not new, but the pandemic has highlighted possibilities in a different way, and BU instructors and administrators are thinking of how to embrace these changes. The looking out from the classroom can also add experiential possibilities in the local environment. So virtual museum visits, for example, will likely be considered alongside or even before an actual field trip. So that's for reasons of cost, logistics of planning, and ease of execution. These will all be factors to bring these experiences to students in an easier way. Variety may be evident in other ways, in offering occasional asynchronous activities as part of regular face-to-face classes, and in offering remote experiences or activities as backup to in-person experiences for students who can't attend class, for students who are sick, for example. So this image is from a lightning talk by Dr. Benjamin Abrams on the Riled Up program in chemistry, and that stands for Remote Immersive Lab Experiences. So, you can take a moment just to have a look at that short description, but essentially the learning assistant, the student in the white coat who was an undergraduate student who works in the lab, excuse me, works with the remote students who you can see on the small laptop screen to conduct chemistry labs. And essentially the students inform the lab assistant of what needs to be done. So it's a sort of a guided remote experience. While this would not be considered part of regular in-person experiences, these teaching approaches give instructors more flexibility to help students stay on track during the semester. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, there is a much greater recognition that equity and inclusion are foundational to the college experience. BU has had a long commitment to these ideas and practices, but the events of the past few years, with the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, the focus on police violence against people of colour, these things have invigorated the commitment. Excuse me, folks, I'm just going to take a short break to have a glass of water. Diversity and inclusion is a major and very active section of the Provost's office at BU, and the new Centre for Anti-Racist Research, headed by Dr. Ibrahim X. Kendi, was established in July 2020. So these efforts to thread inclusive and anti-racist pedagogy and research through the teaching and learning experiences are full of energy and vision. And as we find our way back to supporting student educational experiences as we move forward, these commitments will remain at the core of everything we do. So folks, thank you for your attention. I appreciate being able to tell you about some of Boston University's experiences, our challenges and opportunities. and to think about how they fit in this time of pedagogy throughout the pandemic era. So the pandemic, like many crises, I expect, has been like a kaleidoscope. So often the elements are the same, but we have changed the way we view them, and this is having an impact on how we think about going forward. I'll be happy to reflect further on your questions and look forward to the conversation with you. And for those who are viewing later, please feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. I'll be very happy to hear from you. So thanks so much, folks.